Hello, a very warm good morning to all of you, and welcome to Unacademy. Welcome to today's The Hindu newspaper analysis, where we take a look at the international edition of today's The Hindu newspaper and look at the articles relevant for the prelims and the mains exam. At the same time, we also understand the nuances of answer writing. After all, that is very, very important in order to ace the civil services examination. Now, today in total, we are going to have a consideration of 10 different topics. Not many of them are very relevant for the mains examination. Most of them are relevant for your prelims preparation for today's newspaper. So, the first article that we are going to consider, which has appeared in the editorial page of the newspaper, Socialism, Secularism are the spirit of the Constitution. We are going to discuss what this article is about, even though it is a political article and there is political connotation associated with it, that is, political parties and their role. But then we are going to keep the discussion bereft and without any kind of political inclination. The discussion will be restricted as per what is the interpretation of the article with relevance to the Constitution. This is relevant for your GS paper 2. Careful curation, this is regarding the revision of electoral rolls, which has been observed and which has been ordered by the Election Commission in the case of the state of Bihar. Now, there are various concerns with this particular revision. What they are, we are going to talk about that, relevant for your GS paper 2. Now, there were certain other articles in the editorial as well, which were not that important for the examination. For example, in today's editorial, there is an article associated with parliamentary library and how there is a need to use these parliamentary libraries much more. Now, that is an article that you can ignore, not very relevant for the mains examination. And there is also a Q&A kind of a long article about imperialism of US. Again, nothing new has been discussed there regarding what we have been discussing for the past couple of days. So those articles have been ignored. Now, can the Supreme Court halt an act passed by the state? Now, this is with regards to the contempt proceedings which were filed in case of the state of Chhattisgarh. Now, what that was and the provisions regarding the constitutional arrangement we are going to discuss relevant for your GS2. Now, some of the articles, the remaining of them, are the ones we are going to discuss for your prelims perspective. Government clears indigenous defense procurement worth rupees 1.05 lakh crore post Operation Sindoor. Now, that is a big boost to defense production in India. A new species of tree has been found in the region of Assam, that is Garcinia Kusumae. Now, what is that particular tree species and what we can understand out of it? Three Apache combat helicopters to arrive in India by July 15, and the next three in the next batch will be arriving by the month of September. Endocrine disruptors. So basically, this is a long article in the science section which talks about that how plastic pollution, which was always regarded as a theoretical concept, now that plastic pollution has got the endocrine disrupting chemicals. So what are these chemicals, and what is their impact on human health? That is relevant again for the prelims. Rare earth crunch, a bigger disruptor to the automobile sector as was previously estimated. That comes from CII. Now, services sector growth, as per the PMI, the PMI index, has hit a figure of 60, which is a 10-month high. Now, drones for reforestation have been used in the region of Canada. So, how is it that you can use drones for the reforestation program? That is again something which can be relevant for the prelims. So, these are the overall 10 different articles that have been extracted from the newspaper, which are going to be important for the exam. Having said that, again, to talk about what we are going to offer this particular weekend. So, this particular weekend, that is 5th and 6th of July, we are coming up with the Unacademy Summit, where all the civil services candidates they can attend the sessions free of cost by enrolling in the link provided in the description below. And why should you attend these sessions? First of all, what is the requirement of that? The requirement from the very basics, let's suppose how to prepare the or what are the resources to refer for the subject of geography, how to prepare for your optional, the various different educators, content creators, the Olympians that we have, the distinguished bureaucrats, the judges, and the part of the judiciary. They will be a part of the panel which will help you and guide you through the career defining phase that all of us find ourselves in. So do attend these sessions on 5th and 6th of July and enrich your overall experience and knowledge of civil services examination, the preparation, and the life beyond that. Now, having said that, we move on to the first article of the day, and that is relevant, that has appeared in the editorial section, and that is relevant for your GS paper too. Now, this is Socialism, Secularism are the spirit of the Constitution. So, what is the context of this article? Why has this article been written? First of all, let us understand that. The reason is simple. Now, recently, we celebrate, or we did not celebrate rather, but we observed 50 years since the imposition of emergency, one of the darkest chapters in modern post independent India and the constitutional democracy that we enjoy. Now, that imposition of emergency, that raised several questions regarding whether India could sustain constitutional democracy for a longer period of time or not, and whether our democratic setup is healthy or not. Now, after 50 years, when there was a remembrance, a kind of observation of those dark phases, now thereby there were statements issued by certain political parties to get rid of all the various changes brought about by the 42nd Amendment Act to the Constitution. Most of you would be aware that in 1976, post the imposition of emergency, in case we are not aware, was imposed on 25th of June 1975, remained in force up till 1977. In between that, in 1976, 42nd Constitutional Amendment Act was passed. Now, obviously, Parliament was not functioning the way it should when this constitutional amendment was curated. And 42nd Constitutional Amendment is also referred to as the mini constitution in reference to the number of changes which were brought about in the constitution with the help of this 42nd Amendment. Now, many of these changes were further reverted when the imposition or when the emergency ceased to exist and when the Janta Party government came in with the help of 44th Amendment and so on. They made certain changes into the constitution which reverted the consequences of the 42nd Amendment. However, in popular imagination, in media discussion, and on the discourse on social media, you will hear and consistently come across the fact that one of the key outcomes of the 42nd Amendment of the Constitution, the 42nd Constitutional Amendment, 1976. There were many changes which were brought about in the Constitution with the help of this particular amendment. But the one which has been gaining grounds quite frequently for a few years now is the insertion of term secular and socialist in the preamble. These terms were inserted in the preamble. Now, the argument which is made by many of the political forces have been that since these terms were inserted during the time of the emergency, that has changed the value of the constitution, and this has made these terms to be an artificial addendum to the constitution, which was not originally enshrined by the makers of the constitution. Now, that is where the article is written in that context. The article argues that look, when you talk about the terms socialism, secularism, now these might have been inserted into the constitution as a consequence of the 42nd Amendment, but then the spirit of secularism and socialism was always present in the constitution, be it in part 3 of the constitution or part 4 of the constitution. So the constitutional character of our country does imbibe the aspect of secularism and socialism, and it is not only an outcome of the 42nd Amendment Act 1906. That is the entire premise of the article. Now, first of all, without focusing on the political leanings and the political inclination of this particular article, first of all, let us understand why is it that these words, if they are inserted into the constitution, why is it making such a large amount of hue and cry? Where different political parties are issuing statements, people from different pressure groups are issuing statements, whether this word should be there or not. Can a single word be that very important in the Constitution? The answer is an emphatic yes. Every word, every article, every particular letter which is there in the Constitution carries its own meaning and carries its weight. It shows the way in which the Constitution makers had envisioned a future India to be. And whether we are keeping on the right track or not, the Constitution and each and every wording of the Constitution is an appropriate barometer for the same. Now, here, it is not merely a legal document, it embodies the aspirations, the ideals that a nation state should have. And how did we come across these aspirations, ideals, everything which is included in the Constitution? One of the largest and the lengthiest constitution across the world. Everything was thought upon. And that was a resultant, a culmination of our lived experience, our civilizational experience, our civilizational values, our freedom struggle. Now, all of them, all of these particular struggles, they had taught us a lot of things. And those were put into. So even when, let's suppose, there is a case in front of the Supreme Court, and the judges of the Supreme Court take a particular decision in any direction, be it towards or against. Now, they take a look at the Constitution and they interpret each and every wordings of the Constitution. That is why every insertion, every omission, and every elimination becomes very. Now, here, let us understand that the article argues that even if you ignore these words secular and socialist from the preamble, still the Constitution had enough amount of ideas regarding socialism and regarding secularism. So, how? So, first of all, what do we understand by the term socialism? This is a term that you have been hearing about time and time again. What is this idea of socialism? Now, its definition has changed over the decades. The very root cause and the idea of socialism, that is something which emerged in Europe in the 1900s. And that is when it was emerging as a political idea. But in the 20th century, in the early part of 20th century, very soon, this idea of socialism was juxtaposed with an idea of communist state. And communism became a rallying cry. And the very ideals of socialism that started taking a backseat. But when we talk about socialism, what is the dictionary definition of? So if you take a look at the dictionary definition, any of the various egalitarian, which achieve equality, economic or political theories or movements advocating collective or governmental ownership and administration of the means of production and distribution of goods. Now, the idea is that any large scale production of goods, production mechanism for that matter, that should not be individually owned. That should be owned by the society, so that the decisions which are taken, the decisions which are made, those decisions are taken by the participants in the method of production rather than certain capitalists who are sitting at the top of the food chain. Now, this idea started gaining traction because in the 1900s and the early 20th century, the larger world and the global awakening was against inequality. Mind you, we still are in the midst of a very severe inequality across the globe. But at that point of time, people started thinking that how to remove inequality. Karl Marx had famously said that the world is divided into the haves and the have nots. The haves, who have all the property rights, etc., who have all the money, they can take decisions for a larger or for the larger public, and the larger public has to keep on following that. That is where Marx said that this leads to the vicious cycle of poverty that the working class is always trapped in. Now, that inequality and the persistence of inequality basically enabled the global community to think about a future where the society would own the methods of production. And that was the thought process, even behind insertion of the terms. But then, this term socialist Is it something which is only included or is only included in the preamble and talked about only in the preamble? The answer is no. When you take a look at it, the preamble, other than the term socialist, also mentions justice, social, economic, and political. Now, you cannot achieve social, economic, and political justice in any particular society without having the ideals of equality and removal of inequality, and the factors of production should never be concentrated in a singular hand. Now, the article argues that if you read part 3 and part 4 of the constitution together, then that also indicates that Indian constitution always had the basic DNA of. When we talk about, let's suppose, part 3 of the Indian constitution, that is the part of fundamental rights. Now, within that, when we talk, let's suppose, about article 14, what is it? Equality. Article 14 deals with equality, the importance of equality. Now, equality, again, cannot exist in a society where only few have all the resources under their control. When you talk about article 15, article 16, now both 15 and 16, they talk about the requirement of removal of any discrimination. Any discrimination on the basis of religion, race, caste, sex, that should not happen. The region, that should not happen. That is what the article 15 and 16 they talk about. So equality and removal of discrimination will be fulfilled when? When you have a society consisting of equals. And when do you have a society consisting of equals? When everybody has a joint ownership, ownership in deciding their own fate, in their own destiny. And along with that, if you read articles of associated with part 4, which articles of part 4? So particularly, let's suppose article 38, 39, 41, even 43 for that matter. All of these articles that you read about. Now, these are the part of directive principles of state policy, DPSPs, isn't it? Now, these DPSPs, they direct the state about how the state should behave. So, this is at a level whereby the state should not discriminate. Every person should have equality at an individual level. But how the state should behave also indicates that the framers of the constitution, they thought and they wished the Indian state and the Indian governance method to be that of equality and social justice. Now, just a brief and a customary reading of these particular articles, particularly 38 and 39, because I am sure you guys would have read all these articles in much greater detail. So, a brief customary reading. If you take a look at Article 38, what is Article 38 about? Secure a social order for the promotion of welfare of the people. Right? Now, the state shall strive to promote the welfare of the people. How? By securing and protecting as effectively as possible a social order in which justice, social, economic, and political shall inform all the institutions, or basically form all the institutions of the national life. So even the institutions should have this socialist character, right? Equality. Now, strive to minimize the inequalities in income. Endeavor to eliminate inequalities in status, facilities, and opportunity, not only amongst individuals, but amongst group of people, right? So again, insisting on equality and removal of any kind of certain concentration of wealth, concentration of power. But this is much more clearly defined if we progress to Article 39. And when we talk about Article 39, so what does it talk about? So, state shall direct its policy towards securing that citizens, men and women, have the right to an adequate means of livelihood, that the ownership, this is important, ownership and control of the material resources of the community, ownership and control of all the material resources, the tangible resources that a community has, are so distributed as best to subserve the larger common good. When the factors of production are controlled only by a few, then that leads to discrimination, that leads to concentration, inequality. But when it is owned by a larger public and a larger mass, it is to affect a larger, right? Operation of economic system does not result in the concentration of wealth and means of production for the common detriment. So that tells you about the general socialistic character that the constitution had much before the 42nd amendment to the constitution was even talked about, right? So this basically leads us to the conclusion that the entire argument about socialism was well enshrined into the much earlier. Now what about secularism? Now secularism is not the case, particularly in our case. When we talk about secularism in Indian context, it is different. For example, when we talk about secularism in the French context, with respect to the other constitution. So secularism in Indian context, what does it mean? It talks about, it is not about, by the way, religious neutrality. It is about treating all the religions together, right? Or at the same level. So, positive assurance that state will not have any kind of discriminatory approach towards any religion, right? And protection of minority rights are a very important DNA and a very important factor in that entire fabric of Indian secularism. Now, the argument and the allegation, which is oftentimes muddled towards the 42nd Amendment or otherwise as well, is that this secularism was, and the secular word was inserted during the time of the emergency. And in our case, we have a very different treatment of secularism altogether. The answer to that is always that the constitution makers, the framers, they always thought about the secular characteristic that Indian state should have. That was a learning from our own freedom struggle. Article 25 to Article 30 of the constitution distinctly talk about the secular nature that the Indian state should have and the protection of minority rights. Particularly Article 29-30, they talk about the protection of the minority rights. And the word secular, it is not as if the word secular was only inserted into the preamble. If you take a look at Article 25, Part 2, the word secular is used there as well. So, thereby, the aspect of secularism, again, even if we take a look at the articles from 14 to 16, all of them, they talk about equality and lack of discrimination based on religion. So they also talk about a kind of a positive aspect of secularism where all the religions are treated equal, no discrimination, right? So even without the insertion of the term secularism in the preamble, Indian constitution had the DNA of secularism. The argument can be made forcefully for that matter. So original text of the preamble, even without insertion of the word secular, what was the original text? Liberty of thought, expression, belief, faith, and worship. Now, can you have this enshrined in the preamble if the idea is never to have a secular state? If the idea is never to protect the minority rights? The answer is no. So that is why the aspect of the preamble talking about secularism even prior to the insert term is the key point. Now, secularism overall enshrined and further reinforced with various different articles, Article 14 to 16, Article 25 to 28, right? Freedom of religion and conscience, freedom of practice, profess, and propagate the religion, freedom from religious instruction in a certain educational institutions. Then Article 29 and 30, cultural and educational rights of the minority community. All of them, they reinforce the concept of secularism in the constitution. Now here, what is the importance of these terms? The importance overall is that these are the guiding principle to the welfare nature of the governance, and also one of the guiding light when it comes to constitutional decisions made by the courts of justice. For example, all these included in Part 3 and Part 4 of the Constitution, particularly Part 3, they form the very important basic principles of the Constitution. And in the famous 1973 Kesavananda Bharati case, the Supreme Court had opined that the basic structure cannot be violated, either by legislative action or any other action otherwise, administrative, executive, and so on. So that basically tells us that each and every wording here, that is working as a lighthouse to show us a path into the future. And this is not an absolute random word that we are talking about. These are the learnings which we have gained from our lived experience, our civilizational experience, and also the much fraught freedom struggle that we struggled with. Right? So, this is basically the importance of these particular. Okay? I hope that is understood. Now, the practice question. I hope we are able to answer this. The ideas of socialism and secularism have been included in the Constitution post 42nd Constitutional Amendment 19th comment. Now, here, what is the ask of the question? Is the question asking you, or is the examiner trying to ask you here to explain 42nd Constitutional Amendment? No. The demand of the question is very simple. You have to argue and you have to comment on this statement that the idea of secularism and socialism came into the constitution only after 42nd amendment act, whether that is true or not. Okay, so you have to analyze that. So how do you write the answer for this? What do you write in the intro for this? The intro here, you can say, basically, again, there are various ways and templates in which you can introduce. One way to introduce is by talking about what is the meaning of socialism and secularism. That can also be a method to introduce your answer. Another method to introduce the answer would be starting with the 42nd Constitutional Amendment 1976 brought substantial changes to the constitution, including the insertion of the terms secular and social in the preamble of the constitution. So, in the intro, set the context. Okay. I hope every day when we are discussing these questions and sample questions, talking about how to curate the answers, I hope at least a few of us are able to write the answer and are able to practice. Okay, this is not just for a mere and sheer entertainment that you are simply watching it and thinking you will imbibe some outcome out of it, right? So please do practice it. This is for your benefit that I'm going and we are going into this much depth of answer writing on a daily basis. Okay. Now, here, set the context for insertion in of terms in the preamble. Okay. That is important. After that, that's it. That should be your introduction, nothing more. After that, what do you do? In the body portion, because it is about comment, right? So, in the body portion, you start talking about that these terms, they are not mere addendums, but basically something that the framers of the Indian Constitution had always thought about. So that is where you start writing about evidences indicating that the constitutional provisions other than the preamble also include the characteristic and the DNA of socialism and secularism. Now, please keep one thing in mind. In case in your introduction you have not used or you have not clearly mentioned what is the meaning of secularism and what is the meaning of socialism, do that in the body. In case your introduction itself has talked about the meaning of socialism and secularism, fair enough. Set the context in the body, right? So, whichever approach you are taking for introduction, the body should compensate for the other one. So, here, set the tone for what is the meaning, not a very detailed, okay, brief, because it is a 10 marker. So, in a single sentence or two sentences at max, right? After that, the evidences for both of them separately if possible. Okay. Now, then the conclusion. In the conclusion, what do you write? Conclusion, you talk about the importance. maintenance of secular fabric, and socialist ideas in welfareism. They not only herald a brighter future, but also ensure that as a society, as a civilization, we learn how to move ahead and how to respect the diversity as well as ensure unity of the community that we live in. Like that, you can frame your own wordings. The conclusion should always talk about the importance and the kind of a way forward. Okay? I hope that is understood. Now, what should be the conclusion when the tone of the question is neutral? Always forward looking and positive. Always. Chirag, that is what I gave you the example of. Yeah. Can I mention some fundamental right articles? That is what you have to mention under the evidences. You have to mention the articles. Articles both in part 3 as well as part 4. Okay? Both of them have to be mentioned here. Right? Now, to write the answer, these kind of questions are asked by UPSC quite free. Now, is it correct to say if we frame in our answer by considering what is right and what is wrong? I'm unable to understand your question, Rahul, but if you are asking that should you take a stand that secularism is wrong or right, or socialism is wrong or right, now if you are at the verge of that dilemma in your mind, that you want to issue a judgment that no, secularism is not needed or social, whatever these kind of personal opinions that you have, write it in a piece of paper, fold that piece of paper, put that in the cupboard, lock the cupboard, and throw the keys, as long as you are appearing for the civil services examination. These personal thoughts and dilemmas that you have need not be put into the paper. You are appearing to be an administrator, right? Now, as a future administrator for the government or for the governance and larger welfare of the public, these are the ideas that you should swear by. These are the ideas you should talk about. That, yes, why they are important. In case I am not able to convince you in our discussion of half an hour, then write these in a piece of paper and throw that paper away. But in answer copy, you need to support these ideas. Okay? Manisha, if possible, why not? Now, after that, we come to the other article, that is careful curation. Now, for the past few days, there has been a lot of news doing the rounds with regards to the revision of electoral rolls, which has been initiated by the Election Commission for the forthcoming Bihar elections. Now, what do we mean by electoral rolls, by the way? When we talk about electoral rolls, what is the meaning of that? Now, electoral rolls is an official document consisting of all the voters or including all the voters which are who are supposed to uh, put or cast their vote in any particular election. That is the electoral roll of a region. Now, across the world, the electoral rules keep on being updated. They are updated quite frequently. What is the requirement of updation of electoral rules? Why do we need to update the electoral? Because let's suppose in a broader concept we will understand, and minutiae and minute details you can extract on your own if you understand the larger aspect. Let's suppose you talk about a larger region, your state, any state that you belong from. Now, in that particular district A, let's suppose the electoral rolls have been prepared today. Listing has been done. Now, after 2 years, let's suppose a family moves out, another family moves in, and they start living in. Few people have died, newer people have come of age, isn't it? They have gained the age of 18 years and above, they become eligible to vote. Now, if let's suppose this electoral roll is not updated in the next 10 years, then what does it mean? It means that within that official list of voters, I will still have the names who are long gone, the names of those who basically have died, have moved out, and will not include the names of those people who have started living in that region for a long period of time, or even those names of those newer voters. So, revision of electoral rolls is the absolute necessity for the reflection of the opinion and the will of the voter. Now, the will and the opinion of the voter cannot be expressed unless and until the electoral rolls are updated. Now, the electoral rolls are updated by the Election Commission of India under the provisions provided to it by Article 324 of the Constitution, and also as a consequence of the Registration of Electors Rule RER 1960. So, based upon these two, Article 324, the Representations of People Act 1950, and the Registration of Electoral Rolls Rules 19 uh, or 1960. These are the three norms by which the Election Commission keeps on updating these electoral rolls. Now, here, why is it such a bigger issue, and why is it such a greater amount of conflict when it comes to the political parties in the state of Bihar? Already you have various political thinkers like Yogendra Yadav, who wrote a detailed article in the Indian Express, citing it as a part of a larger conspiracy in order to manipulate the voting patterns across the country, to have bogus voters put in and the genuine voters to be eliminated. So the opposition parties, they are up in arms, and the election commission is adamant that we need to carry out this revision. But before we go into the details of what this revision is, so here, first of all, the types of revision. Now, the types of revision basically here, they are driven by Rule 25 of RER 1960. RER 1960. What is RER 1960? Registration of Electors Rule 1960. Now, as per this, there are three types of revision: summary revision, where a broader revision is done, not going into the absolute details, and a broader revalidation of the voting list and the electoral roll is done. Right? Then you have intensive revision, where all the suggested or all the voters who have not been there in the previous electoral roll, now, if they want to be included, they have to show the proof of residence, the proof of birth, etc. And that is very intensive exercise. And then you have partly intensive, partly intensive, and partly summary. Right? Now, in general, what do you observe that almost every year or before every election, this summary revision of electoral rules is done, and there is not much of a debate, noise which is created by that. But this time, before the Bihar election, intensive revision of the electoral rules is cited by the Election Commission. And that is what has created a lot of noise around it. Now, why is there a need, basically, or why is there a talk of this intensive, summary intensive revision of the election? The reason for that. First of all, when was the last revision of the electoral rolls carried out in Bihar? That is important. If you think about it, now that last revision was not carried out the last decade or in the last 2 decades also. The last revision was carried out in detailed revision was carried out in 2003. Now think about it. There have been 22 years which have passed. Now voters would have many new voters would have been born after that, for that matter. Now their name, if not included in the summary revision, would have not been there in the electoral rolls at all. Many people have migrated permanently out of the state. Now, Bihar is a state consisting of a large group of migrant population. Now, in our previous news analysis, we had discussed one article which talked about capturing the migrant population's vote being one of the important criteria for a state like Bihar, where you have daily wage earners and other people also migrating out of the state, both on a permanent as well as a semi permanent basis. So, for that, you need to understand what is the electoral roll out there. Now, hereby, understand this. When we talk about the need for revision, this is also keeping in mind migrant population, migration pattern, right? And also the case of many people who have passed away, new eligible voters, and so on. But there is a larger concern which is raised. The concern is that this intensive revision of electoral rolls, if you are carrying that out, the process which has been charted out by the election commission, it talks about that, look, if your name was not there in the previous electoral rolls, if you want your name to be there, if you are a new eligible voter, you have just reached 18 years of age and so on, you have to furnish the documents, right? The documents need to be furnished. Which documents are we talking about? Birth certificate and residential proof. These are the documents which indicate that you are actually a resident of that state. Now, the finalization of this document verification is thought to be done by end July. End July. Now, the fear which is present and the concern which is there, which is very logical as well, is that let's suppose those migrant population who are not living in Bihar right now, but who would want to vote and who are permanent residents of Bihar. Now, they won't be able to furnish documents before the officers, the booth level officers, prior to July end. So their name will be stuck off for from the electoral rolls for a longer period of time, isn't it? So what about the migrants? Migrants who are unable to publish the document. Now, another important issue which has been raised for the past few days. Now, it is not written in the article, but it is important to discuss that as well. Now, I told you that Yogendra Yadav had come up with a detailed article talking that this is a part of a larger conspiracy. While that is an idea which can be debated, whether it is a larger conspiracy or not, but there was an important point which was raised in that article. The point being that the onus of being a voter of a particular region has now shifted from the state, the voter, by this particular action. What is the meaning of the statement? Let us simplify the statement. Whether I am a voter in Bangalore or Karnataka, now earlier the state would carry out the verification process and the state would keep on updating that. The argument is by carrying out this exercise, there is a large scale shift of responsibility for the voter from the state, the eligible voter. So it is now the responsibility of the eligible voter to prove to the election commission that yes, I am a registered voter of this particular region. Which means what? Which whose implication will be what? Many eligible voters who are not able to show their documents in time, who are not able to furnish those documents in time, they will be discarded from the electoral list. And at the same time, the burden of proof becomes so very heavy that this will further reduce voter participation. Right? So understand this. The burden of proof is going to, whether for right or for wrong. Now, that is a matter for separate discussion. But the reality as a consequence of this action is burden of proof shifts the voter. And when the burden of proof shifts to the voter, voter participation will be further less. Isn't it? Now, for an electoral democracy, voter participation is an important yardstick to determine whether the democratic exercise is being carried out successfully or not. So, this is not a good example for that matter. Now, what is the way forward in this? All of us here who are present, all of us will agree that revision of electoral rules is a must. I, I'm sure nobody will deny that fact, that revision of electoral rules is a must. Now, when you revise those electoral rules, document submission is also a must. Otherwise, there will be many of the fake names in the electoral list. But at the same time, the burden of proof is also an issue. So, what is the way forward in this? Always when the election commission has been knowing that, let's suppose the state of Bihar goes to election at the end of 2025, why couldn't this exercise be carried out, let's suppose, since past 1.5 years? After all, the voters from that particular state will have a much greater time available to them in order to furnish the document. In case they don't have those documents, they can make those documents or they can get those documents, isn't it? So there should be a larger time window which should be escrowed. At the same time, the very important parameter when it comes to electoral rolls and the revision, etc., is the requirement and the importance of transparency regularly on a kind of a portal, on the kind of a district list. The voter rolls and the electoral rolls can be and should be published. It is available to the political parties, but then that should be available to the larger public much prior as well. Now it is done through the apps, but in those areas already election commission has got the app where you can track whether you are a voter in a particular constituency or not. But then in areas where you have still got the digital divide, where that digital literacy is not that high, in those cases there can be public declaration of these roles, that these names are there in the voter list, and in case you don't find your name, you can come and contact us. So that transparency is a must, because without that transparency, the very faith in the electoral democracy and the parliamentary system of election, that erodes. And that is where we get a kind of a perfect consequence of misgovernance. Right? So I hope this particular issue is understood beyond this article as well and into a greater depth. Okay? Now, the issue of the migrants to be dealt with, and that is where capturing the migrant population. So, what do you need to do? Greater time allocation, greater time allocation, one of the issues. Other than that, greater consultation with the parties in question, greater amount of consultation with the with the individuals, political groups, pressure groups, etc., and transparency. These are a must. Okay. Now, after this, we come to the practice question. Discuss the importance of revision of electoral rolls in a parliamentary democracy. A 10 marker answer needs to be written for this. So, how do you write the answer for this? In the introduction? The intro, you have to talk about what do you mean by electoral roll? What is it? Then in the body, you start by talking about who does it. The Election Commission of India. Under which provisions? So basically Article 324, then Representations of People Act 1950, and Revision of Electoral Rules 1960. Now, the types of revision also you mention. Summary revision, intensive revision, part summary, part intensive revision. Then talk about that when we talk about the need for the revision of the electoral rules, why is there a need? Updation, regular updation to capture the migrant population, to capture the new voters, and to capture or also to eliminate the redundant voters which are there, or the redundant names which are not eligible for voting anymore, who have moved to other states, who have passed away, all of that. The importance to capture the public opinion, the best possible accuracy as possible. Right? Like that, you can write the answer. Okay? Now, after this, we move on to the next article. Census data is useless in order to get the migrant data. Yes, census data does not capture the migrant details. It is carried out on a decadal basis. So that is why the census data is not very appropriate. In fact, the first time a detailed migrant aspect or the enumeration was captured by the economic survey in 2016 2017. If you look at that economic survey, and if you take a look at the source of that data, Arvind Subramaniam would be the CEA, Chief Economic Advisor at that point of time. Now, where did they fish the data to get the amount or the number of migrants? They actually used a very innovative idea to take a look at the railway reservations, the railway tickets. And with the help of that, they could gauge an idea about the internal migration which was going on. And that is when they got to a realization that, in fact, millions of people, they tend to, right, domestically, right? So that is why census details are not very apt. Now, I have a question by Nad. When fresh batch of geography optional will start for 2026 batch? As of now, there is no intention to launch a fresh batch for geography optional for 2026. This is a call made by the management. In case you want to take a look at the English optional for geography, you can take a look at the recordings which are available. But no new fresh batch is being launched as of now. Okay? Now, after this, we come to the other article. Can the Supreme Court halt an act passed by the Parliament? Now, hereby, when we talk about the entire article, the context of it. So, the context of it is set by a contempt plea which was filed in the Supreme. There was a contempt plea which was filed whereby the PIL talked about that Supreme Court should actually punish the Chhattisgarh government, or actually hold the Chhattisgarh government for contempt in action. Why? Owing to the fact that Supreme Court in 2011 had made a statement, had made a judgment in the famous case of Nandini Sundar and others versus the state of Chhattisgarh. Now, what was this case about? Now, those of us who are unaware, now Naxalism problem, or the problem of left-wing extremism, has prevailed in the region, particularly across the Red Corridor, for a long period of time. Now, thereby, many of the states like Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, what they started to do, they started utilizing and arming the local tribal population with certain small arms and so on. And basically, they were made to fight against the Naxal attacks as well. Now, the tribals and the villagers, they oftentimes found themselves in the crosshair of both the Naxals as well as the security force. Because the Naxals, they would be angry that these villagers, they have targeted us. And if they would not pick up the arms, the security forces would look them with a suspicious eye. So that is where the entire movement, which was named as Salva Judum in the region, now that Salva Judum was seen to be extrajudiciary, right? And that is something which was seen to be illegal. That is when you had a case which was filed in the Supreme Court that please ensure that this is not carried out. This process is not carried out. In the judgment which was issued by the Supreme Court, certain fierce observations were made. Now, Supreme Court said that how can you do this? How can you arm untrained individuals? And how can you put them into the battlefield? Now, they have not signed up for this, and there is no provision for this. Now, this is violative of Article 14 and 21, right? Now, they were referred to as the special police officers, SPOs. So, how could you do this? So, it termed the entire thing as illegal and banned these groupings like the Salvajud. It also directed the union government that you should also not make any rule, right? And you should not fund this recruitment of special police officers. Now, after this, immediately after the Supreme Court judgment, Chhattisgarh government made a new law whereby it changed the legislative aspect of it. It provided a legislative power to itself whereby it created Chhattisgarh Auxiliary Armed Police Forces Act 2011. So think about it. Judiciary issues a particular judgment where it says that special police officers, Salva Judum, arming of tribals is illegal. What does Chhattisgarh government do? Create a new law whereby it makes it legal as per the law, as per the state legislature. Now, it basically creates certain mandated recruitment conditions. For example, auxiliary police force to aid security force. They will not be the frontline forces. They will aid the security force. And what did the Supreme Court had? What was the judgment and the observation of the Supreme Court? Supreme Court had said that look, they are poorly trained and inadequately paid. At the same time, you have to recall all the firearms that you have issued. Poorly trained. So, what does that legislation do? Legislation said that they would not take frontline combat roles, first of all, and at least 6 months of training would be done. Only after that, after fulfilling the required conditions, would someone be ready. So, it is like bypassing the judicial observation. Now, that is where you had recently, in the recent days, a fresh petition which was filed that the Supreme Court should hold the Chhattisgarh government accountable for contempt action. Supreme Court in its observation has said that look, we cannot hold the state government for contempt based upon whether it has framed a legislation or not. And that is where it cited the previous case, that is Indian Aluminium Company and the state of Kerala. Under this particular case as well, the Supreme Court, in its observation, had focused on particularly the doctrine of separation of powers, of separation of powers. Judiciary has got its own role, and legislature has got its own role. In the case of Indian Aluminium Company versus the state of Kerala, again the case was the same. If you analyze the details of the case, Supreme Court had made an observation. Now, after that, you basically had the state government forming a new legislation to bypass the judicial observation. Now, there also, the Supreme Court had opined that this doctrine of separation of powers needs to be respected so that there is no judicial overreach or no overreach of other arms of governance. So that is where the Supreme Court holds its stance that state legislatures, they have got the plenary powers to enact laws unless that law is unconstitutional or unless that law violates the basic structure of the constitution. You can frame a law, right? Passing a new law, even on similar lines, cannot be contempt of court unless it directly violates an express directive of the Supreme Court has directly said that let's suppose in this particular territory you cannot deploy the police forces and you deploy that is violation. But Supreme Court had talked about special police officer, and here Chhattisgarh government is doing what? Creating a separate branch with the help of training, the training of arms, and then a proper recruitment cycle. So it is not an express directive which is being violated, but a separate mechanism, a channel, an official channel, so to say, being created. So thereby, it is not illegal. Courts must respect the doctrine of separation of powers between the judiciary and the executive. So that is the crux and the nutshell of this particular article, whereby the case example has been taken for the case in Chhattisgarh, that is Nandini Sundar and others versus the state of Chhattisgarh. To keep that in mind, and the aspect of when a contempt proceeding cannot be initiated against the state legislature. Okay. Now, certain articles which have been in news relevant for the prelims. First of all, government clears indigenous defense procurement worth 1.05 lakh crore. Now, this is post Operation Sindoor. Now, this is a big boost to India's defense acquisition and, most importantly, India's defense production, indigenous defense production. All of them have been ordered under the by category of India indigenously, IDDM as it is referred to, indigenously designed and developed and manufactured. Okay, under this category. So that is also referred to as IDDM. Okay, this was the revision of the procurement policy in defense production, which was done around 2016 in order to bolster the self reliance in defense. Now, this large scale procurement is in which category? That is important to note, not only for those who are defense enthusiasts, but even for your prelims purpose. One is your QR SAMs. What are QR SAMs? Quick reaction surface to air missiles, the one which is indicated in the image. Now, this is usually employed or deployed for air defense against drones, against aircraft. Now, this is your final tier of defense. After this, you generally tend to deploy guns. But in terms of missiles, this is one of the final layers. It has got a shorter range, very shorter range of around 10 to 15 to 20 kilometers, in certain cases 30 kilometers. Beyond that, you have the MR SAMs. That is where the category of the Barak missiles, they come in the case of MR SAMs, and then you have the LR SAMs. So, like that, you have the various different ranges. Now, this is a short range. QR SAMs are short range for air defense. So, this has been ordered to bolster the air defense. Then you have the EW suites. What are EW suites? Electronic warfare, electronic measures and countermeasures. For example, during Operation Sindoor, you would have observed the statement by the DGMOs where they said that we used various different static and kinetic actions in order to prevent the Pakistani drones from reaching their targets. Isn't it? Static and kinetic action. Kinetic action means you fire a missile against a drone, the drone is destroyed. But what is that static action? You basically electronically jam the drone and the electronics of it, or you spoof it. You, in a way, hack it, or you send so much amount of electronic signature noises that it tends to get misled. Rather than hitting the target here, the drone is misled or the missile is misled somewhere else. So that is your electronic warfare, right? So EW suites. Also, what has been ordered amongst the other categories, towed vehicles, etc. Another interesting part is the autonomous submersible vehicles. Autonomous submersible vehicles, they can be used in general to carry out shallow water attacks against an enemy navy and the kind of complete disarmament of the naval force. This is generally used by elite special forces across the world for stealth activity. Now, this has also been ordered. Now, one of the important aspects is that your elite commandos will have this, especially the Marine commandos or the Marcos. The other important aspect to note is that we have developed the capability to manufacture autonomous submersible vehicles. Till now, this capability used to exist in certain countries like the US, China, France. Germany was developing it. UK is said to have developed it. But India also has got a reliable development chain and a link to it. So that makes it important. Now, then another article, new Garcinia species found in Assam named after botanist's mother. So we are talking about Garcinia Kusumae. Now you don't need to know the name of the botanist or the name of botanist's mother. You just need to focus on the species in question. So this Garcinia Kusumae, now it is basically it is an Assamese tree variety, where in Assam it is also known as Toikora. Now, here it is known for its edible fruits in general. Now, it grows alongside uh, bamboo, the trees of shisham also. Now, eretia, in all these areas, it will tend to grow. So, moist regions, in some amount of moisture, that is where it will grow. Edible fruits, medicinal properties, anti obesity, and anti diabetes effect as well. So, that is the aspect of this particular species in new. Now, then after that, three Apache combat helicopters to arrive in India by July 15th. Now, the defense minister of India has had a kind of a dialogue with his US counterpart, where many statements were made. First of all, India's right to self defense, preemptive strikes, all of that were made. But certain important discussions on defense was also done regarding the supply of the Apache helicopters. Apache is a combat helicopter. Now, Indian Army had ordered these Apache helicopters and placed that order with the US. But then the delivery of these Apache helicopters have been very staggered, and for a long period of time, this has impacted our offensive capability. Now, mind you, these Apache helicopters, they are deployed by the Strike Corps, the one which is meant for the offensive action. These will be placed in the region of Jaisalmer, right at the bordering region. Now, they have a state-of-the-art technology with helmet mounted display, whereby the arms and the targeting system, for example, if the pilot looks in a certain direction, automatically the target shifts in that direction. So that is one of the capable state of the art technology that these Apaches have. Also, they have a low radar cross section. So they have some of the stealth characteristic which is required by these helicopters, and they can flow at a terrain hugging height, very low height, which can evade detection by radars as well. At the same time, in this particular discussion, another important point was raised, and that was regarding the engines to be supplied. Now, I hope we are aware that India is manufacturing the Light Combat Aircraft, LCA, particularly the LCA Mark 1. That delivery has been pending for a long period of time from the side of HAL. And the argument is that this tends to utilize the GE404 engine, General Electric's 404 engine. And GE is not supplying that engine, due to which our rollout of LCA Mark 1 has been delayed. So that is what the discussion was held. And at the end of the discussion, it was understood, it was agreed upon that the engine supply is one of the key areas that both of them have to focus on for the quicker rollout of LCA Mark 1. Okay? Now, after that, a detailed article has appeared in the science section of today's newspaper, that is Endocrine Disruptors in Plastic Waste, a new public health threat. So basically, the context of the article is that look, India is the largest plastic polluter in the world. Not amongst the largest, but actually the largest. Whereby we end up producing close to around 9.3 in terms of the tonnage, etc. 9.3 tons in terms of the plastic waste almost on a daily basis. Right. Out of this, only close to around 5.3 they are. So it is 9.3 million tons, rather, I apologize, tons per year. Out of that, 5.3 million tons per year, they are burnt, incinerated. Rest of them, almost 4 million tons, they are out there in the environment. They get broken down into smaller size. That is what we refer to as microplastics. These microplastics get embedded in our skin, and that is when they cause hormonal issues. They have been found to cause hormonal issues and also issues in terms of reproductive health of humans, more particularly pronounced in regions like India and China. So here, these are known as EDC, or endocrine disrupting chemicals. What are these EDC? So basically, bisphenol A and overall BPS, they are used in water bottles, food containers, and thermal paper. Also, you have phthalates, that is DEHP, and also PFAS, also known as forever chemicals. All of these, they get inserted into our skin and into our digestive system eventually. The outcome of it is that they mimic or block the natural hormones, that is estrogen, testosterone, thyroid hormones, and cortisol, which is leading to, in many cases, the case of Mumbai has been cited where the experiment was done, sampling was done. In majority of the samples across major Indian cities, the early reaching of puberty due to testosterone excess or difficulty in terms of the reproductive cycles due to the issue in the follicles, and also the semen samples containing microplastics in China and India. So the influence is very significant. Now, they interfere with receptor binding, disrupt gene expression in reproductive organs, and induce oxidative stress and inflammation. So, what are those chemicals? What are EDCs and what is their impact? Now, rare earth crunch, a bigger issue for auto firms than expected, is a statement which was issued by Confederation of Indian Industry, CII. Now, CII basically, in its briefing, talked about that the fact that I hope we are aware that the Chinese, they have put a kind of an export ban on the rare earth element based magnets. Now, many of the magnets which are devised, they use these rare earth elements. Now, as a consequence, multiple different sectors of production across the world, particularly in manufacturing, they have been impacted. Countries from the US to India, they have been impacted by the supply shortage. Now, this also brings to attention that we need to have a kind of a robust supply chain characteristic or a logistic method where we are not only dependent on countries like China, because China has done it previously as well. Now, automobile sector in our country is going to be impacted where they are expected to carry out production cuts. Now, when you cut down the production, what does it lead to? It leads to unemployment. Why are you carrying out production cuts? Because you don't have the minerals, the critical minerals. You don't have those magnets. Now that will lead to unemployment, and that unemployment will further fuel loss of demand in the economy because people don't have enough money to spend because they don't have a job. And as a consequence of that loss of demand, lower production again, right? And that lower production again fuels the cycle of unemployment. All of this because of lower production due to supply chain issue. Okay, so that is the cycle that the Indian automobile sector is staring at. Now, services sector growth hits 10-month high as the demand surges. So basically, Purchasing Managers Index or PMI. This Purchasing Managers Index is a kind of a survey mechanism where newer orders, the price pressures, the newer employment, everything is carried out amongst the industry. And basically, for the month which has passed, there is an idea for the manufacturing sector and also the services sector which is carried out. Now, if this PMI number is around 50, that means there is no growth, no contraction. If it is less than 50, that means the sector is contracting. If it is greater than 50, that means there is an expansion. Now, PMI for the services sector have for the month of June has indicated number of 60, which is very, very high. This is based on newer demand in the services sector. And that is fueled by the domestic demand, which is a good news because when services sector faces a newer demand, its ability to generate employment is manifold. It is a job multiplier where let's suppose $1 that is put in the services sector can yield, for example, tourism can yield $6 in the allied activities. As well. So like that, it can have a job multiplier effect. Okay. Now, coming to the last article, that is Canada uses drones for reforestation of wildfire hit forests. So, the region of Canada has been experiencing wildfires quite frequently in the past decade and a half. Or not, if you even if you take a shorter time window, almost for the past 5 years, wildfire events have been very common. Now, generally, when you have a wildfire, if you leave that area, naturally there will be regrowth of the forest. But then the problem is that if every year this wildfire keeps on destroying your forests, then the time to regrow will be so high that in the long run you will always face a decline in the forest health, decline in the forest area. So what many regions have started to do, including Canada, they are using the drones to spread the seeds. Now the seeds basically are embedded in a capsule. Okay, they use AI in order to map the physiography, water requirement, natural climate of a region in order to understand the suitability of a particular seed in a region. Now, what do? They basically use the capsules, and in that capsule, they bring the seeds, some of the fungal species as well, to ensure greater rate of germination. And the seeds that they are using are for black spruces and jack pines. Now, overall, the seeds are protected in the capsule. So the capsule consists of some moisture, seeds, and fungi to ensure faster germination. Okay, so that is being done. It can also be incorporated in countries like India. Okay, so that brings us to the end of the discussion for the day. I hope the discussion was meaningful and has added some of the content. Now, if you have liked the discussion, put that in the comment section and don't forget to click on the like, share, and the subscribe button. Tomorrow, we will meet in the evening for the discussion of the places in news for the month of May for the month of June 2025. Do take a look at the space of the Unacademy IAS English channel and thereby ensure your revision for the places in news so that it is carried out in a comprehensive manner. Tomorrow and day after tomorrow, there is also that summit where you can interact with the various educators firsthand and gain experience. So, till that point of time, do take care. Goodbye. Thank you.